President Trump has had a history of targeting black people long before he ever ran for any office.
Somalia has many natural resources, including uranium, iron ore, tin, gypsum, bauxite, copper, salt, natural gas, pastures, phosphate, guano, and coal. According to the International Trade Administration, Somalia may have at least 30 billion barrels of oil and gas reserves. Amazing Somalia is rich.
Boom. Somalia just took control of its imports. Mogadishu, Bosaso, and Berbera ports are now under ECTN control, and this gives Somalia 5 huge economic benefits. 1. Total control of sea imports. Somalia can finally decide what enters the country and what doesn't. 2. Protect key industries. Somalia can choose its most important sectors like fish, farming, cement, and salt.
The world never expected this from Somalia, not Washington, not Europe, not even Africa itself. But at dawn, with one bold announcement, Somalia shattered decades of foreign dominance, sent the United States into a wave of panic. A complete ban on key US imports. Not a warning, not a negotiation, but a full shutdown. In an instant, the country long underestimated transformed into the loudest voice of Africa's rising power.
Somalia is sitting on one of the easiest moneymakers on earth. Somalia has over 40 species of aloe, one of the highest numbers in the world. Some of them exist only in Somalia, but we barely use any of it, and that's shocking, because aloe is one of the most profitable plants globally. The gel becomes skincare, the dried leaf becomes powder, the yellow latex is used in medicine, and the extracts go into soaps and beauty products. Almost every part of the plant has value. On the world market, a ton of aloe.
Ships were turned away at Mogadishu's ports, American exporters froze, diplomats scrambled. And across Africa, millions watched in disbelief as Somalia stood tall, unapologetic, and unshaken. This wasn't just a policy shift, it was a declaration, a message to the world that Africa would no longer fold under pressure, no longer accept unfair deals, no longer serve as a silent market for foreign interests.
Most Somalis do not know that Somalia has barite. What is barite? It's a heavy mineral that oil and gas companies can't drill without. Every single oil well in the world needs barite in its drilling fluid to keep the well stable and safe. But that's not the only use. It's also used in paints and coatings, in plastics and rubber products, in glass and ceramics, in electronics, and even in medicine, as an X-ray contrast. It's everywhere in modern industry.
So for the first time in modern history, Somalia had flipped the script. And now Washington is scrambling to answer the question that terrifies it the most. What happens when Africa finally fights back and wins the first battle?
My biggest fear in life is that this man may never witness our full takeover. Yes, he may never witness that. He already witnessed our partial takeover, our little success in America. And he is the reason, actually, I know that the community in America is thriving. He is how I know. It's like
To President Trump and the base that is attacking our community, we understand that you are here to divide us, to create fear amongst us, and to selectively target the blackest immigrant and Muslim community in this great state.
If President Trump right now is watching the Somali community, we would like to invite him to come visit in our state. This state is great. We have diversity, the largest immigrant communities here. Actually, we want to tell the president, we're not a garbage. Actually, we smell really good.
The announcement came at sunrise, carried first by local radio stations before erupting across global news screens. Somalia had issued a sweeping ban on select U.S. imports, halting a decades-old flow of goods that Washington once assumed would never be challenged. The declaration stunned analysts, rattled U.S. trade officials, and ignited a storm of debates across Africa, where many saw the move as a long-awaited turning point. For the first time in modern diplomatic history, Somalia publicly defied Washington in a way few expected and even fewer believed the country had the leverage to do. But Somalia knew exactly what it was doing. The ban was not a reckless act. It was strategic, calculated, and backed by a newly strengthened alliance of African economies. Determined to break the long-standing pattern of unequal trade relations, over the past decade, the continent's coastal nations had undergone a transformation. Ports once dominated by foreign interests were now under domestic control. Export terminals, logistics hubs, and maritime trade corridors had been restructured under African ownership. That shift gave Somalia the confidence to stand firm when Washington attempted to pressure it into renegotiating a maritime policy that favored American shipping giants. Instead of yielding, Somalia responded with a decision that echoed far beyond the Horn of Africa. It declared certain American imports unwelcome, particularly products that undercut local industries or manipulated market prices. For generations, Somali manufacturers struggled to compete with subsidized U.S. goods. Every attempt to nurture domestic factories collapsed under the weight of cheaper imports. But the Somalia of today was no longer isolated, fragmented, or dependent. It was backed by Africa's largest economies, supported by new trade pacts with Asia and the Middle East, and powered by rising regional industries. Washington underestimated this shift. Within hours of the ban, global shipping routes experienced disruption. Cargo vessels bound for Mogadishu rerouted abruptly. American exporters panicked. As reports revealed that the ban extended not only to agricultural goods but to household products, processed foods, machinery components, and fuel additives. These items had quietly dominated Somali markets for years, but now containers carrying them were turned away at the port. The message was clear. Somalia would no longer be a passive destination for foreign control. It was asserting itself and, by extension, asserting Africa's new economic identity. Other African nations observed closely. Leaders from Kenya, Tanzania, Ethiopia, Ghana, and South Africa issued statements of support, emphasizing that Africa's sovereignty in trade decisions was long overdue. Many hinted they were ready to take similar steps if pushed. For the first time, African nations were positioning themselves not as competitors but as partners defending the continent's collective economic future. Inside Somalia, the mood was electric. Factories that had operated at half capacity prepared for expansion. Local farmers, long overshadowed by cheaper imports, celebrated new opportunities. Small manufacturers announced plans to increase production. Investment proposals started pouring in. What Washington perceived as a provocation, Somali citizens saw as liberation and economic rebirth fueled by dignity and self-determination in Washington. However, the reaction was far from celebratory. Officials scrambled to understand how a nation they once viewed as economically dependent had built enough leverage to take such a bold stance. Analysts hurried to trace the roots of the decision: infrastructure investments from within Africa, energy partnerships in the Gulf, expanded security cooperation with regional blocs, and rising domestic industries that no longer needed U.S. approval to grow. Somalia had quietly built a foundation strong enough to withstand economic pressure, a reality that caught American policymakers completely off guard. Experts on global trade began warning that the Somalia decision was not an isolated event, but the spark of a larger continental shift. Africa was learning to say no, to negotiate, to refuse in fair terms, to challenge long-standing dominance. The continent's role in global geopolitics was reshaping faster than Washington anticipated, and Somalia just exposed how dramatically the balance had shifted. Meanwhile, European leaders followed the developments with concern. If Somalia's defiance spread, Europe's own trade influence, already weakened by rising African regional integration, could erode even further. Meetings in Brussels and Paris focused on crisis avoidance. Diplomatic envoys reached out quietly to African capitals, offering investment packages in exchange for stability. But few African governments seemed eager to return to the old ways. The simple truth was becoming impossible to ignore: the era of Africa's passive compliance was ending. Somalia's rise as a geopolitical voice was not accidental. Its leaders understood that geography was power. Its coastline was one of the most strategically significant in the world. Half of the global trade that passed through the Red Sea corridor relied on it. Control of those waters meant influence, and influence meant leverage. Somalia was no longer afraid to use. At home, Somali citizens rallied behind the decision. Streets filled with discussions of national pride, economic independence, and a future no longer tied to foreign dictates. Universities held debates on the geopolitical implications. Business leaders announced new consortiums focused on boosting domestic supply chains. Local banks reported surges in applications for industrial loans. It was as if the entire country had stepped into a new era overnight. Across East Africa, neighboring nations saw the move as a catalyst for deeper cooperation. Discussions intensified around expanding regional manufacturing, boosting crude processing capacity, and fortifying domestic agricultural industries. Africa, long fragmented into isolated markets, was beginning to function like a unified economic force, something global powers had hoped would never happen. In Beijing, the response was calm but strategic. China saw Somalia's move as an opportunity. Analysts framed it as proof that Africa was ready to operate as a sovereign partner rather than a dependent market. Offers for technology transfers, maritime training, and industrial financing were prepared. China's interest wasn't rooted in ideology, it was rooted in recognition that Africa's rise presented the next frontier of global growth. Washington, meanwhile, attempted damage control. Officials urged dialogue. Proposals for renegotiation surfaced, but Somalia was in no mood to retreat. The country stated clearly that any future agreements must be based on fairness, mutual respect, and sovereignty, terms rarely afforded to African nations in past decades. What happened next surprised even Somalia's closest allies. Reports showed that U.S. companies were already feeling the shock. Exporters who relied on Somali markets scrambled to find alternatives. Manufacturers warned of losses. Politicians, facing internal pressure, pushed for aggressive action. Some demanded retaliatory tariffs, others advocated for diplomatic sanctions, but none acknowledged the underlying truth. This was not a Somali crisis, it was a global shift. Africa was beginning to fight back, and Somalia had just fired the first shot. The shockwaves from Somalia's defiance rippled across the continent with astonishing speed. African nations, long accustomed to watching global powers dictate economic policies, suddenly saw a blueprint for resistance. In West Africa, leaders gathered privately to discuss how Somalia's move might open the door for broader Continental assertiveness. In southern Africa, economists debated whether resource-rich nations should reconsider export deals that overwhelmingly favored foreign corporations. Even landlocked countries, historically deprived of leverage, recognized that the shifting geopolitical climate offered new opportunities to renegotiate terms once accepted without question. It wasn't simply the ban itself that stirred such energy, it was the symbolism. Somalia had done what few believed possible, it openly challenged one of the world's largest economies, and did so without fear. The message was unmistakable: Africa no longer had to bow. The era of unchallenged influence was eroding. What made this even more disruptive was the timing. The global economy was fragile, supply chains were unstable, and a growing technological competition between Asia and the West had put extraordinary pressure on Washington. Somalia's decision, therefore, was not just an economic disruption, it was a geopolitical provocation at a moment when the U.S. could least afford it. The ban highlighted a truth many in Washington wished to ignore: Africa's cooperation was not optional, it was essential. In Mogadishu, the government doubled down. It announced a new framework designed to protect domestic industries from foreign dominance. This framework included incentives for local manufacturing, investment partnerships with African regional blocs, and a strict requirement that any foreign corporation operating within its borders must meet transparency and fairness standards previously ignored by Western companies. To global observers, the shift signaled a philosophical change. Somalia was no longer seeking approval. It was setting terms, but Somalia's boldness triggered a storm of reactions inside the U.S. Congress. Lawmakers argued fiercely. Some urged diplomatic pressure, warning that allowing an African nation to defy Washington would embolden others. Others cautioned that pushing too hard could accelerate Africa's pivot toward Asia and the Middle East. Business groups lobbied aggressively, insisting that Washington take immediate action to protect American export industries. Yet beneath all the noise, one uncomfortable truth simmered: the U.S. had become overly reliant on African cooperation. Agriculture, textiles, energy, maritime routes all were intertwined with African markets. Losing influence in countries like Somalia posed risks few had anticipated. As the debate intensified, the U.S. sent diplomatic envoys to East Africa, hoping to reverse the ban through negotiation. These envoys offered revised trade terms, investment pledges, and promises of deeper security cooperation. But Somalia knew the value of its position. With support from neighbors and trade partners, it refused to bend. The foreign policy script that once worked effortlessly for Washington was no longer effective. Somalia's resilience created an unexpected ripple. African citizens across the continent began to see the possibility of change. Social media platforms buzzed with discussions about sovereignty, economic justice, and the need to break free from foreign economic dependence. Scholars wrote articles celebrating Africa's growing leverage. Civil society groups pushed for similar reforms in their own countries. Even young students debated the long-term implications of Africa's newfound assertiveness. While Washington wrestled with rising anxiety, Beijing watched patiently. China had spent years investing in Africa's infrastructure, manufacturing, and digital networks. Somalia's bold move aligned perfectly with Beijing's long-term strategy. Chinese analysts framed the ban as a milestone in Africa's strategic evolution. Commentators predicted that if more African countries followed Somalia's lead, the global power structure could shift dramatically. Across the Gulf, nations also saw opportunity. They offered Somalia oil deals, port rehabilitation funds, and energy cooperation packages that came without political conditions. Somalia, now in a position to choose rather than accept, began evaluating these offers with pragmatic confidence. Meanwhile, Europe found itself caught in an uncomfortable position. European leaders had hoped the U.S. would maintain its influence in East Africa, ensuring a familiar geopolitical balance, but Somalia's decision threatened this arrangement. European economies relied heavily on African imports, agricultural goods, minerals, energy components, and any shift in alliances could further destabilize Europe's already struggling industries. Concerns grew that Africa, strengthened by unity and external partnerships, might soon impose terms that Europe had never before considered. African nations, however, remained primarily focused on their own continental future. Regional blocs discussed harmonizing trade regulations to make Africa less vulnerable to external pressure. The African Continental Free Trade Area gained unprecedented momentum as nations recognized that unity was not just symbolic, it was economically transformative. Somalia's stance fed this momentum. The idea that a single nation could withstand a wave of diplomatic retaliation inspired a deeper push for collective independence. In East Africa, Kenya and Ethiopia explored joint manufacturing zones aimed at replacing goods previously imported from the U.S. In West Africa, Ghana and Nigeria considered policies to protect their own domestic industries from foreign dumping practices. In Southern Africa, attention shifted to strengthening mineral processing facilities so raw materials would be refined domestically instead of being exported cheaply only to be imported back at high cost. As Africa mobilized for a new era, the U.S. faced growing internal strain. Businesses dependent on Somali markets reported losses. Shipping companies raised concerns about rerouted supply lines. Tech manufacturers that sourced certain components from East African ports warned that delays could affect global production. Washington realized that it had underestimated the interconnectedness of modern trade and the growing importance of Africa's position in it. Somalia's leaders addressed the nation frequently, emphasizing that the decision to ban select U.S. imports was not born out of hostility but necessity. Decades of unfair trade practices had weakened Somali industries. The ban was a corrective measure, one that prioritized national development over foreign interests. The explanation resonated deeply with Somali citizens, who felt that for the first time in a generation, they had reclaimed control over their own economy. Across the continent, the symbolism of defiance mattered just as much as the practical gains. Africa had often been portrayed globally as a region without agency, a place acted upon rather than acting, but Somalia's move shattered that narrative. It showed the world that Africa was no longer willing to accept unequal trade relationships, political pressure disguised as partnership, or economic dependence masquerading as aid. The question in global think tanks shifted from how will Somalia recover to how will the world adjust. For Washington, the realization came late but clear. Somalia's decision was not an isolated act of rebellion. It was a signal that Africa, empowered by unity and global diversification, was ready to rewrite the rules. Every policymaker, investor, and strategist now understood that ignoring Africa's rise was not just naive, it was dangerous. Meanwhile, in Africa's major cities, a sense of pride swept through the streets. Somalia had done what many believed was impossible. It had stood tall. It had fought back. It had changed the course of a continent's future, and the world had no choice but to adapt.